TikTok, and on Discord. How is everyone today? Has everybody had something to eat? Has everybody had
Hello, all of you
water
on YouTube and Twitch,
and
TikTok, and on Discord?
that is an echo. Yeah, has everybody eaten something? Much better. So, another Wednesday and more Orientalism. And yes, I know it is a heavy text. It is one of the most seminal texts. If you're just joining us, if you're starting to join us, I recommend that you catch up with the other episodes that I have on my videos on Twitch and YouTube. And yeah, we'll dive right into page... Where did we stop? We stopped on page 160. The book and follow along. It is page 116. This is chapter 2. And when we think about Orientalism, when we think about the Orient, it is always thought of the East. What is the first thing that comes to mind when you think of, especially the word Orient? Because it's quite a specific term. I asked my students this a couple of years ago when we first studied Orientalism, and, well, the first time that I taught it at a university level. And a lot of them said a part of the world that is now in the past. They thought geishas, which are now, it's a dying profession. They thought old school religions. They thought old practices that have no place in modern society. So think about what first came to mind when you've heard the word Orient. And think about why. Why do we think the Orient is this mystical place? Why do we think that the Orient is a place that is a bygone relic of days long past? And think about, in a highly compressed form of this brief episode taken out of Flaubert's notes for Bouvard and Péchuet, frames are the specifically modern structures of Orientalism, which, after all, is one discipline among the secular and quasi-religious faiths of 19th century European thought. We have already characterized the general scope of thought about the Orient that was handed on through the medieval and Renaissance period, for which Islam was the essential Orient. During the 18th century, however, there were a number of new interlocking elements that hinted at coming evangelical phases, whose outlines Flaubert was later to recreate. For one, the Orient was being opened out considerably beyond Islamic lands. This quantitative change was due to a large degree of the result of continuing and expanding European exploration of the rest of the world. And I like that he says European exploration of the rest of the world, because it wasn't discovery, it was exploration. The increasing influence of travel literature, imaginary utopias, moral voyages, and scientific reporting, I would say pseudo-scientific reporting, brought the Orient into sharper and more extended focus. If Orientalism is indebted principally to the fruitful eastern discoveries of Anquetil and Jones during the latter third of the century. Anquetil, sorry, I keep on saying Anquetil. Anquetil and Jones during the latter third of the century, these must have been seen in the wider context by Cook and Bougainville, the voyages of Tournefort and Addison, by the president of Brosse's Histoire de Navigation aux Terres Australes, the navigation of the Australasias, by French traders in the Pacific, by Jesuit missionaries in China and the Americas, Patagonians, savages, natives, and monsters supposedly residing to the far east, west, and south and north of Europe. But all such widening horizons had Europe firmly in the privileged center as the main observer. Or mainly observed, as in Goldsmith's Citizen of the World. For even as Europe moved itself outwards, its sense of cultural strength was fortified. Now, for those of you who came into the reading earlier when I was getting ready for tonight, we were reading Inglorious Empire by Shashi Tharoor. He was talking about the language of instruction in Indian schools, and how cat, please stop. I just got the book. Where the hell did I put it? Oh, never mind. Because I'm not going to be able to find it. And welcome in newcomers. Hi, Dr. Jace.
Hello.
So, yeah, it's been a day. I hope you're well.
What do you mean been a day? Did you not sleep? Isn't it just been the same day?
Managed to get just learning everything that I've been learning over the past few months, especially about how Dr. Jen, this comment, I'm about to take a napalm myself. I assume you mean nap. But yes, napalm bad, nap good. How Europe positions itself as the moral center of the world, the economic center, the religious center, the scientific center of the world, posing their languages as not just intellectually but morally neutral. And then going on to judge other languages and other forms of knowledge as morally and intellectually inferior. That is the basis from which we are coming when we look at studies such as this. From travelers' tales, and not only from the great institutions like the various India companies, colonies were created and ethnocentric perspectives secured. It was always the plan to dominate, never to trade. So the joke that we made, that people constantly make, that, you know, white people conquered half the world for spices and then never used them in their food. The idea was never to use those spices. It was never to have fair trade. It was never to have a fair sense of any form of relationship with the Orient coming from the Occident. It wasn't to hoard either. It was to have control and monopoly over the trade of said item. Whether it was spices, whether it was... It does seem true because, I mean, white people do season their food with thoughts and prayers. But it... So from every single perspective that we have been taught from throughout our lives, from the time we were in primary school, from the fairy tales that we were told, it was always from the Eurocentric perspective, so that Eurocentrism is normalized. For another, a more knowledgeable attitude towards the quote-unquote alien and exotic was abetted not only by travelers and explorers, but also by the historians for whom European experience could profitably be compared with other as well as older civilizations. Of course, they would never say that these were older civilizations. They would say that these are inferior civilizations. And yes, I know, Dr. Jace, you have garam masala, and that's a plus. That powerful current in 18th century historical anthropology, described by scholars as the confrontation of the gods, meant that Gibbon could read the lessons of Rome's decline and the rise of Islam, just as Vico could understand modern civilization in terms of the barbaric, poetic splendor of their earliest beginnings. The first thing that the colonialists did when they reached a foreign shore was to ascertain how different the people were, and if they were different, destroy their literature. Orientalism, Edward Saïd, one of the most important books in sociological history. The goal isn't the end, it's the control of the means. Exactly. And I'm going to screenshot that. Thank you so much, Everett. So I was with Abdullah on a live just now. We were talking about violence, and I'll get into that just now. But it was often through violent means. I think it was always through violent means, be it physical violence or ideological violence, that domination was secured. And anything that started through physical violence was maintained through ideological violence. And that maintenance of ideological violence was always from a Eurocentric perspective, making us think that anything outside of heteronormative white masculinity is abnormal. Thoughts and prayers taste like sad butter. I quite like that. This light is very, very bright.
For lighting, it looks like 2 bars either side of the camera. It helps offset like harshness.
And usually my mic is in the way of this light, but I don't know what's up with the light today. It's just really, really bright. Clots and pears. Dr. Jace, if it wasn't for Eastern Europe, Western Europeans wouldn't know what pears are. Pots and prayers. Oh, I told one of my friends who has POTS, the medical condition POTS, who's also pansexual, that they're pan with POTS, so they should come out of the cabinet.
Okay, I've noticed my dyslexia gets weird when I toot a little bit, for
Yeah.
the pod. Cause like I've been, microdosing to help treat my, my PTSD, which happens to be intimate based, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so like, screw an exposure therapy. It's intimate based. What do you mean exposure therapy for intimate based? Like,
Yeah, what do you mean?
PTSD?
No.
So, yeah. So like, we've been trying the copium route. I mean, we've done like lots of therapy, EMDR and whatnot, right? But like, copium, some weed. Oh, brilliant.
Oh, absolutely.
Pots and
Abso-fucking-lutely.
Pots and prayers.
Pots and prayers. So the ideological violence that exists that we currently are dealing with, when that ideology fails, when that ideological push fails, they go back to physical violence. And we are seeing it now, that people are realizing that immigration is not bad for the US because, we have facts and we have information. We have far more access to information than we ever did before. And so the people, you have a system that is that as soon as the ideology stops working, it will always go back to another form of violence, which is physical violence. That is why we are seeing ICE on the street. That is why we are seeing countries increasingly militarized. That is why we are seeing the IDF getting away with such absolute fucking atrocities. Because if the ideological violence fails, the physical violence has to succeed. And that violence is entrenched in European identity. You cannot divorce violence from the state that was created by the colonizer. Whereas Renaissance historians judged the Orient inflexibly as an enemy, those of the 18th century confronted the Orient's peculiarities with detachment and with some attempt at dealing directly with Oriental source material, perhaps because such a technique helped a European to know himself better. They're always at the center of it, George Saleh's translation of the Quran and his accompanying preliminary discourse illustrate the change. Why is it that, unlike his predecessors, Saleh tried to deal with Arab history in terms of Arab sources, and he let Muslim commentators on the sacred text speak for themselves? So generous. How generous of you. Still, fuck you. As throughout the 18th century, Saleh's simple comparatism was the early phase of the comparative disciplines like philology, anatomy, jurisprudence, and religion, which were to become the boast of the 19th century method. But there was a tendency among some thinkers to exceed comparative study and its judicious surveys of mankind from China to Peru by sympathetic identification, saying, oh, no, we don't want to dominate you, we want to understand you. But we only want to understand you through our already confirmed biases, through our own writings of previous years. And so, yes, we understand because we all bleed red. It's giving all lives matter. This is the third 18th century element preparing way for modern Orientalism. What today we call historicism is an 18th century idea. Vico, a national idea which an outsider could penetrate only by the act of historical sympathy. Thus Herder's Is Din zur Philosophie, display of various cultures, each permeated by an inimical, I do not know that word. What does inimical mean? Oops, sorry for the noise. Tending to obstruct or harm. Inimical, yes. So a harmful creative spirit, each accessible only to an observer who sacrificed his prejudices. Imbued with the populist and pluralist sense of history advocated by Herder and others, an 18th century mind could breach the doctrinal walls erected between the West and Islam and see hidden elements of kinship between himself and the Orient. Napoleon is a famous instance of this, but usually selective. Identification by sympathy. Mozart is another. The magic flute, in which Messianic codes intermingle with visions of a benign Orient, and the abduction from the Seraglio, Locate a particularly magnanimous form of humanity. Fake that really is thoughts and prayers. Yes, nicety. Thank you. Because this is not true empathy that they're doing. This is like, we're including your stuff in ours. We are representing you as human. Yeah, we are human. So what? Turkish music drew Mozart sympathetically eastwards. It is difficult, nonetheless, to separate intuitions of the Orient as Mozart's from the entire range of pre-Romantic and Romantic representations of the Orient as an exotic locale. Niceties, kindness not included, exactly. Popular Orientalism during the late 18th century and the early 19th attained a vogue of considerable intensity. But even this vogue, easily identified in William Beckford, Byron, Thomas More, and Goethe, cannot be simply detached from the interest taken in Gothic tales, pseudo-medieval idyls, visions of barbaric splendor and cruelty. Thus, in some cases, the Oriental representation can be associated with prisons, luxury ambiances, and exotic sublimity of late 18th century paintings. Later in the 19th century, in the works of Delacroix and literally dozens of other French and British painters, the Oriental genre tableau created representation into visual expression and as a life of its own, which this book unfortunately must scant. Sensuality, promise, terror, sublimity, idyllic pleasure, intense energy. The Orient as a figure in the pre-Romantic, objectively and adjectively called Oriental. But this free-floating Orient would be severely curtailed with the advent of academic Orientalism. The fourth element preparing the way for modern Orientalist structures was the impulse to classify nature and man into types. Here I get to one of my favorite topics, taxonomy. Thank you. Yay. One of my favorite topics is taxonomy. I did not study taxonomy. I studied Carl Linnaeus. And we'll get into that just now. Rip taxes. No, not that kind of tax. Taxonomy as in the greatest names are, of course, Linnaeus and Buffon. But the intellectual processes by which bodily and soon moral, intellectual, and spiritual extensions, typically materiality of an object, could be transformed into spectacle, from spectacle to the precise measurement of characteristic elements, and it became widespread. The naming tree, exactly. See, Dr. Jace, plant taxonomy is what Carl Linnaeus specialized in. He was a botanist. He then decided to do the same for humans. Yeah. Unlike...
Wait, can you run that back? How do you mean?
Okay.
Okay, can you run that back? How do you mean? Like, okay, so you said that he ran it for the people?
Yeah, he decided to do the same thing as plants. We almost stopped using his system at all, exactly, Dr. Jace, because he was so fucking problematic. But Carl Linnaeus was a Swedish botanist who founded the Swedish Institute of Racial Biology. He was the first person to put people into racial groups and basically fund all of the pseudoscience that we got about African people's brains and, skull sizes. Affected in Sweden, they give him the honorific Carl von Linné. The bastard.
That's just proof that anyone who can spin a narrative gets tweeted within history as a demigod for that.
Abso-fucking-lutely. Oh, during 2020 protests, they protected his statue. Because the Swedes, they like to think that they're like Caribbean right up until the 1970s.
Well, people also forget that India, freshly was colonized as of World War II. Like, fresh.
1947 was when the British were driven out.
Like, it's a generation back, and it's, like, right there. But, like, that's part of the propaganda campaign, though.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like, going back to, like, the official name scheme, it's propaganda.
It's all propaganda. It's all lies and propaganda. But what Carl Linnaeus did, and the fact that the Swedish Institute of Racial Biology still exists at the University of Uppsala today, even though it's a historical building and they no longer do the work of racial biology, the work still exists. It's still preserved. And a lot of people still believe it. Case in point, the AFD in Germany, the Nordforce in Sweden, Rasmus Paludan's political party in Denmark, I can't remember what they're called. Those people cling to the work of people like Linnaeus, who classified people into races so that they could be, so that they could justify slavery and colonization. That is entirely why they did what they did. And the fact that they hold him in such high esteem in Sweden just shows that they don't care about people of color. Linnaeus said that every note made about a natural type should be a product of number, form, proportion, and situation. And indeed, if one looks into Kant or Derrida or Johnson, there is everywhere a similar penchant for dramatizing general features, reducing vast numbers of objects into smaller numbered or orderable or describable types. And in natural history, anthropology, cultural generalization, a type had a particular character which provided the observer with a designation and, as Foucault says, a controlled derivation. These types and characters belong to a system, a network of related generalizations. And why do you think the West loves to put things into boxes? Because once you define something, you can control it. Thus, all designation must be accomplished. You must know its opposite. To know what properly appertains to one individual is to have before one the classification or possibility of classifying all others. So everything is known in relation to the West. Everything in relation to whiteness, everything else in relation to maleness. So the Europeans, in doing all of this quote-unquote research, they set up what it was that was the norm, and everything thus different to that. And that is why I constantly go back to Foucault and saying we cannot extricate ourselves from whiteness. Blackness and brownness exists in relation to whiteness. In the writing of philosophers, historians, encyclopedists, and essayists, we find character as designation appearing as psychological moral classifications. There are, for example, the wild men, Europeans, Asiatics, and so forth. These appear, of course, in Linnaeus, but also in Montesquieu, in Johnson, Blumenbach, Sommering, and Kant. Physiological and moral characteristics are distributed more or less equally. The American in red, choleric, erect; Asiatic, yellow, melancholy, rigid; the African, black, phlegmatic, lax. But such designations gather power when later in the 19th century they became allied with character by the precision with which dramatic, almost archetypal figures, primitive man, giant heroes, are shown to be the genesis of current moral, philosophic, and even linguistic issues. Thus, when an Oriental was referred to, it was in terms of such genetic universals as his primitive state, primary characteristics, particular spiritual background. The kind of wording that we have used here is so indicative of a controlling power, saying, we are better. Like, essentially, that's exactly it. Thank you. We are better, you can't sit with us. The four elements I have described, expansion, historical confrontation, sympathy, and classification, are the currents in 18th century thought, on whose presence the specific intellectual and institutional structures of modern Orientalism depend. Now, and I think it goes beyond just the Orient in terms of how things were described, how things were classified. And I think the place that it has impacted the most is Africa. And we don't even need to look into Walter Rodney to actually gain how that manifested. It's visible today in neocolonialism and how people devalued black lives so that they could be traded as chattel through these classifications that were essentially to justify slavery and colonization. Without them, Orientalism, as we shall see presently, could not have occurred. Orientalism couldn't have occurred, but neither could the colonization of Africa, the scramble for Africa, the Berlin Conference, have occurred. Because once they couldn't control the trade of people, they wanted control of the trade of goods from those people. Not even tribal lines, no. There were no tribal lines. People were moving with the seasons as to what they needed. These elements had the effect of releasing the Orient generally, and Islam in particular, from the narrowly religious scrutiny by which it had hitherto been examined and judged by the Christian West. Reading Orientalism by Edward Saïd. In other words, modern Orientalism derives from secularizing elements in East longer Christianity and Judaism, with their fairly modest calendars and maps, but also India, China, Japan, Sumer, Buddhism, Sanskrit, Zoroastrianism, and Manu. 2. Capacity for dealing historically and not reductively as a topic of ecclesiastical politics with non-European and non-Judeo-Christian cultures was strengthened as history itself was conceived of more radically than before. To understand Europe properly meant also understanding the objective relations between Europe and its own previously unreachable temporal and cultural frontiers. Like, where did Christianity come from? In a sense, John of Segovia's idea of the contraferentia between the Orient and Europe was realized, but in a secular way. Gibbon could treat Muhammad as a historical figure who influenced Europe, and not as a diabolical miscreant hovering somewhere between magic and false prophecy. The Romans pissed out Christianity. Yeah, I mean, but like, where did they conceive of this idea of this very, very brown Jewish man from Palestine as being the savior of white Europe? And then they made him white. He was made white in Italy by the Catholic Church, by Rodrigo Borgia. In particular, the Pope, Rodrigo Borgia. It is all just propaganda. I mean, come now. We know this. Rip Brown Jesus. Yeah, he's in Alligator Alcatraz right now. The second coming didn't go so well. with Border Patrol. Yesterday, on somebody's live, I played the second verse of a Hayley Williams song. I'll expand on that in a minute, AC. A Hayley Williams song called True Believer. She says, they say that Jesus is the way, but then they gave him a white face, so they don't have to pray to someone they deem lesser than them. Yeah. Ways of cementing control over a white population? Yes, partially, but also cementing white supremacy in non-white places. Because if you look at the image of white Jesus that were put in, it's a really famous painting, and I cannot for the life of me remember who did it now. I used to know because I studied. And that is the image that was put in all brown churches all over the world. It was by a British artist, I think. And what does it feel like to be told, if you are not this, you are going to hell? But here, come pray to your colonizer. It is an abusive, manipulative tactic. Ottomans were far later, but Persia definitely. The West has always been at war with Persia. During the time of Borgia, no, the Ottoman Empire was a little bit later. It was Persia. Now Iran. The West has always been at war with Iran. Interesting fact. The image of white Jesus that people pray to, that was a gay man. Rodrigo Borgia commissioned, and what he meant was white man, because Leonardo da Vinci was doing this work for the church, almost exclusively at that point, working for the church. He met Rodrigo Borgia's great nephew, Cesare Borgia. The man the homophobes pray to was a gay man having an affair with Leonardo da Vinci, who was then considered a heretic. I find that fucking hilarious. The Ottomans were around for a very long time, but it was Persia. I think it's perfection. My aunt, who is one of those, it's okay, you're sweet and all, but you're going to hell. That's the kind of person she is, like a born-again Christian. I replaced one of her pictures of Jesus with the Obi-Wan Kenobi. Yeah, he just needed money. He worked almost exclusively for the Vatican because they paid him so well. So I replaced one of her pictures of Jesus with Obi-Wan Kenobi. I don't know if she's ever noticed. I don't think she has. Yeah, Gonzo, it is absolutely one of my favorite facts as well. I gladly gave up one of my little posters of Ewan McGregor. Yeah, Da Vinci didn't. He hated the church. That's why he was considered a heretic. Oh, we have gone so off topic here. A selective identification with religions and cultures, not one's own, have worn down the obduracy of self and identity. which had been polarized into a community of embattled believers facing barbarian hordes. We've seen the story time and time again. It was Commissar Sean. She was talking about it in her live, and so was Super Solid. If you don't follow Super Solid and Commissar Sean, please do yourself a favor. Watch my legs, and I don't know what Super Solid's name on TikTok is. But please do yourself a favor. Go and follow both of them. They're absolutely brilliant. How we played cops and robbers. The cops were always the good guys for some odd reason. A-cab all day, every day. And playing cowboys, as Super Solid called it today, cowboys and pejorative. No, in cops and robbers, like how people played them worldwide, the cops were always meant to be the good guys. Cops were slave catchers. We were taught about these embattled groups that are doing so much to save people, and the barbarians who insist that anarchy is the way to go. I always thought the thieves were the good guys too. Me too. This is why we are friends, AC. The borders of Christian Europe no longer served as a kind of custom house. The notions of human association and possibility acquired a wide general, as opposed to parochial, legitimacy. And finally, the classifications of mankind were systematically multiplied as possibilities of designation and derivation were refined beyond the categories of what Vico called genteel and sacred nations, race, color, origin, temperament, character, and types, overwhelming the distinction between Christian and everyone else. But these interconnected elements representing a secularizing tendency is not to say that the old religious patterns of human history and destiny and the existential paradigms were simply removed. No. They were never removed. Christofascism has always been a thing. Far from it, they were reconstituted, redeployed, redistributed inside the secular frameworks, just enumerated. For anyone who studied the Orient in secular vocabulary in keeping with these frameworks, it was required. Yet if Orientalism provided the vocabulary, the conceptual repertoire, the techniques. Thank you so much, Taro. For this is what, from the end of the 18th century on, Orientalism did, and what Orientalism was. It also retained, as an undislodged current in its discourse, a reconstructed religious impulse, a naturalized supernaturalism. And what I shall try to show is this impulse in Orientalism that resided in the Orientalist conception of himself, of the Orient, and his discipline. Thank you, John. So essentially what they were doing was rebranding. So some of my students, well, one specific class of my students, they're all a bunch of nerds, and all of them play D&D. All of them love just nerd and geek stuff, gaming and all of that kind of stuff. We got along very well from the first lecture, and it was so much fun. At the start of every lecture, I tell them to roll for initiative. Their final assignment, their group assignment, is to rebrand Mordor as a tourist destination. We didn't play cops and robbers, but we played capture the flag, so the robbers were the good guys. Yeah, true. No apology needed. There's a season of Super Sentai that comes. Oh. You know my relationship with anime is tenuous at best. Thing is, That is essentially One Piece in a nutshell. Like a bunch of communist pirates just like fucking everyone up. And yeah, I think a lot of people are very surprised when I say I don't actually enjoy One Piece. Yeah, they are communists, so I mean anarchists, communists. Depends where you're from, same. Exactly. And I find Usopp's voice very annoying. The modern Orientalist was, in this view, a hero rescuing the Orient from obscurity, alienation, and the strangeness which he himself had properly distinguished. His research reconstructed the Orient's lost languages, mores, even mentalities, as Champollion reconstructed Egyptian hieroglyphics, out of the Rosetta Stone. The specific Orientalist techniques like lexicography, grammar, translation, cultural decoding restored, fleshed out, and reasserted the values both of ancient classical Orient and the traditional disciplines of philology, history, rhetoric, and doctrinal polemic. But in the process, the Orient and Orientalist disciplines changed dialectically, for they could not survive in their original form. Even in the classic form, in which the Orientalists usually studied, the Orient was modernized, restored to the present. The traditional disciplines, too, were brought into contemporary culture, yet both bore the traces of power, to have resurrected, create an individual generalization. In short, having transported the Orient into modernity, the Orientalist could then celebrate his method, his position, as that of the secular creator, a man who made new worlds as God had once made the old. As for carrying on such methods in such positions beyond the lifespan of any individual Orientalist, there could be a secular tradition of continuity, a lay order of disciplined methodologies, whose brotherhood could be based not on blood lineage, but among common discourse. A praxis, a library, a set of received ideas, a doxology, common to everyone who entered the ranks. It's the intellectual military. And those smoking room libraries where they had cigars, whiskey, and were surrounded by old books that they were unwittingly destroying with their cigar smoke. Those were circle jerks. Flaubert was prescient enough to see that in time the modern Orientalist would become a copy, and Ernest Renan, no such danger was apparent. Which is technically gay. Why are you gay? My thesis is that the essential aspects of the modern Orientalist theory and praxis, from which present-day which have been secularized, redisposed, and reinformed by such disciplines as philology, which in turn were naturalized, modernized, and laicized substitutions for or versions of Christian supernaturalism. Every single change in history that we see whiteness and white supremacy has a way of morphing itself throughout the centuries, redefining itself so that it can take a hold of current language and methods to reinforce itself. That is why I constantly say it doesn't just move the goalpost. White supremacy is like a cancer, changing its form every time we think we have a grip on it. Whiteness is a virus. It's constantly evolving to save itself. In the form of new texts and ideas, the East was accommodated to these structures. Linguists and explorers were contributors to modern Orientalism, like Jones and Anquetil. Certainly. But what distinguishes modern Orientalism as a field, a group of ideas, a discourse, is the work of the later generation. If we use the Napoleonic expeditions of 1798 to 1801 as a sort of first enabling experience for modern Orientalism, we can consider its inaugural heroes in Islamic studies, Saysi and Renan and Lane, to be the builders of the field, creators of a tradition, progenitors of the Orientalist Brotherhood. What they did was to place Orientalism on a scientific and rational basis, entailing not only their own exemplary work, but also the creation of a vocabulary and idea that could be used impersonally by anyone who wished to become an Orientalist in their study. Their inauguration was a considerable feat. It made possible a scientific terminology, banished obscurity, and instated a specific form of illumination for the East. It established a figure of the Orientalist as the central authority for the Orient, legitimized a special kind of coherent Orientalist work, put into cultural circulation as a form of discursive currency, by whose presence the Orient henceforth would be spoken for. Above all, the work of the inaugurators carved out a field of study and family of ideas, which in turn could form a community of scholars whose lineage, traditions, and ambitions were at once internal to the field and external enough for general prestige all over the colonies. The more Europe encroached upon the Orient, the more Orientalism gained a public confidence. Yet, if this gain coincided with a loss in originality, we should not be entirely surprised, since the late 18th century and 19th century ideas, institutions, and figures I shall deal with further in this chapter are an important part, a crucial elaboration, of the first phase of the greatest age of territorial acquisition ever known. By the end of World War I, Europe had colonized 85% of the earth. To say simply that modern Orientalism had been an aspect of both imperialism and colonialism is not to say anything disputable, yet it's not enough to say it. It needs to be worked through analytically, historically. I'm interested in showing how modern Orientalism, unlike the pre-colonial awareness of Dante and de Bello, embodies a systematic discipline of accumulation, and far from being exclusively an intellectual or theoretical feature, it made Orientalism fatally tend toward systemic accumulation of human beings and territories. To construct a dead or lost Oriental language meant ultimately to reconstruct a dead or neglected Orient, meaning that reconstructive precision, science, or even imagination could prepare the way for what armies, administrations, and bureaucracies would later do to the ground, in the Orient. In a sense, the vindication of Orientalism was not only its intellectual or artistic successes, but its later effectiveness and usefulness in authority. Surely, it deserves serious attention on all these counts. And that is where I will stop today. Because next week we'll get into part 2, the Saysi and Ernest Renan, Rational Anthropology and Philological Laboratory. That one's going to be very, very heavy. So, yeah, prepare yourselves. Same time, different book tomorrow. I'm going to carry on the tiki-taki for a few minutes to Discord, YouTube, and Twitch. I shall see you all tomorrow. And I might just hang around in the Discord later on today, depending on how much I need to body double. So, ciao. TikTok, I'm staying on for a little while.